Bienvenidos al coloquio virtual del capítulo América Latina de ASCOLA. Como ustedes saben, esta es una serie de encuentros que hacemos en donde invitamos a autores a que presenten sus libros o sus papers y un comentarista o una comentarista nos ayuda con una visión crítica, hace preguntas y luego ustedes tienen la oportunidad de preguntar. El día de hoy, pues ustedes saben, en nuestro coloquio virtual se titula La competencia nos está matando, está formulado en términos de pregunta, pero realmente obedece a un libro que escribió Michelle Meagher y que publicó el año pasado con la editorial Penguin, que se llama Competition is Killing Us, que es una afirmación. Michelle Meagher es fundadora del Balanced Economy Project y es Senior Policy Fellow en UCL Centre of Law en el Reino Unido. Y Fernando Araya, que está en Chile, es profesor de la Universidad Diego Portales, es también consultor en una firma en Santiago de Chile. Y además Fernando escribió una reseña del libro en español, entonces ustedes no conocen, digamos, el trabajo de Michelle en español, pues Fernando básicamente ya les da una mano con un resumen y unos comentarios críticos. Luego por el chat les voy a compartir el link por si quieren saber. Y pues yo simplemente les voy a leer un párrafo que me parece muy provocador del libro de Michelle, lo voy a leer en español. Dice lo siguiente. Perdón, que se me perdió de la emoción. Ya, así, dice, del prefacio, dice, tenemos un problema creciente con el poder corporativo en nuestras sociedades porque hemos fallado en entender cómo la libre competencia en el mercado realmente funciona. La competencia no dispersa el poder, crea el poder. Y no toda la competencia es buena para nosotros. El mantra insistente de que los mercados libres y competitivos son libres y competitivos es un mal chiste. Y para nuestro planeta empobrecido y para nuestra sociedad es realmente un eslogan desafortunado. Entonces, con esa frase muy provocadora de Michelle, cierro, digamos, mi introducción y a continuación voy a hacer el switch a inglés. Michelle and Fernando, welcome on board. Thank you very much for joining us today in the colloquium of the Latin American chapter of ASCOLA. Michelle, you have already told our viewers that you wrote The Competition is Killing Us, but of course it would be great if you could share with us a bit of your own story about your life, how something that you tell readers in your book, how things evolved from being a corporate lawyer into something different that you're creating, and it's wonderful if you can tell us how you have reinvented the way you deal with competition law and policy. And Fernando, of course, welcome aboard, and it's great. This is actually, this was Fernando's idea. He wrote to me, he said, look, we should invite Michelle, and I said yes, of course, and you should be the one who comments. Well, it's a great honor to have both of you. And I'll start with Michelle. Michelle, could you please tell us a bit about you, and then, of course, I know you have a presentation.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's really a privilege to be here. I was trying to figure out which paragraph or which section from my book you were reading. I couldn't figure it out, but I gather it was very provocative, which is what I think a lot of the sections of the book could be classified as that. Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I think I'll start my presentation and I'll weave it in because I think that will make more sense. Let's see. Hopefully you all can see that. Okay. So the starting point really for kind of talking about the book. So the title of the book is Competition is Killing Us, How Big Business is Harming Our Society and Planet and What to Do About It. And the starting point really is to think about the title. So when I go into the real content, you'll see that my perspective really places me quite firmly in the school of thought of kind of progressive antitrust policy. But the kind of most common pushback that I get is progressive antitrust policy. If it says anything, it says that we have unaccountable monopoly power and we should have more competition. And actually, this idea that competition might be harmful in some way seems to kind of create quite a lot of friction. So the question I get is, what is with this title? And I'll explain a little bit more kind of the genesis of the book, which will make sense of that. But in essence, what the book does is it attempts to really explore this concept of competition and how this concept has been used to justify steadily increasing market power. It also tackles head on this paradox of capitalism that we can have on the one hand, and sometimes in the very same markets, too little competition and unaccountable monopoly power, but also in some aspects of competition, too much competition. And the real central theme of my book is that it matters how companies compete. We cannot be agnostic about the way companies compete. And I think that competition policy has tended to be quite neutral about that. And we have to acknowledge and understand the impact of imperatives such as shareholder value and the reality of negative externalities. These cannot necessarily be dealt with elsewhere. We may have to think about them within competition policy. What this means is, if competition is sometimes problematic, it means that doubling down on competition may not be the answer. More competition, just kind of blanket proposal of more competition, won't necessarily help things. It also kind of at a more philosophical level, I've come to the kind of understanding that sometimes when you're challenging the existing paradigm, it's not really possible to use the tools of that paradigm, and competition, efficiency, consumer welfare, those are really the tools of the current paradigm. So the core question that I attempt to answer in my book is, why is it that corporate capitalism creates huge wealth, but that wealth is concentrated and the power is concentrated in so few hands, and yet the system is very generous at spreading its harms extremely widely? And I think all of this has implications for rethinking competition policy. So the book really came out of two parallel conversations. You'll be very familiar with the conversation that's happening in antitrust enforcement. The soul searching of what are the goals of competition law? Is competition law fit for purpose? Should we revisit consumer welfare? That's a term that's not really present, or it's not present at all in the EU treaties. It's not present in the US Sherman Act. I believe it is actually a concept that is present in some other competition laws, potentially in Latin America. And there are interesting questions over kind of how some of these concepts have been transplanted from different legal regimes. Against this, we have this evidence of markets concentrating, markups growing, very few, but some ex post merger review showing that actually even in in markets that competition policy would consider to be relatively unproblematic. So if you have a merger in a market where you have 6 players, it tends to find that afterwards you end up with an increase in prices. So then you have this kind of overall question: is competition law working? And obviously the kind of main challenge to the prevailing antitrust orthodoxy has been the rise of big tech and all of the ways in which that phenomenon has kind of really spoken to some kind of failure within our analysis. But actually, I'll kind of pause there and tell a little bit about my story before I go on to the second half of this slide, because in around 2013, I was having a sense of this first part, this kind of failure of competition policy. I had this sense that perhaps it was not the case that competition was this unalloyed good. Maybe it was not a universal panacea solution, but also this other sense that competition policy wasn't even achieving competitive markets. So we had these kind of two ideas, and I didn't really have the language to describe them then, but in my book I describe the kind of the light bulb moment for me, which was when two things happened at the same time. So one was the devastating Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, which is my country of origin, where my parents are from, and understanding that the kind of global supply chain and the way that international competition is played out on that kind of international stage was somehow having just this incredibly exploitative impact on these incredibly vulnerable people, and people who, in another life, that could have been me. At the exact same time, I was working at a big law firm in London, doing major mergers and so on. And I was working on a soft drinks merger at the time. And we were very earnestly putting together our efficiency defenses for the merger, putting together the entire package of everything we were putting to the competition authorities. And, I really enjoyed that work. But something about it started to unravel for me. I think it's incredibly, I worked with the smartest people I've ever worked with, incredibly stimulating, interesting work. But this nagging question of why was it that we weren't asking, or no one was asking some of the questions about, what were the broader impacts of this soft drinks merger? What were the impacts on health and so on? Now, we might say that's nothing to do with competition policy. But then we had, later on, we had the sugar tax case, which was an issue of a case around state aid. And then there were, questions around what are the health implications? Was this, and that was actually relevant to the question of competition and to this subsidy. So, I didn't quite have all of the pieces of the puzzle at the time, but these were the kind of nagging questions in my mind. At that stage, without a fuller answer, I decided to leave competition law. And I still really strongly believed in the power of the private sector to do good. That's why I had gone into competition policy, because I truly believed that more competitive markets spread around the world would produce better outcomes. So I went in search of companies that were doing good. That led me into the corporate governance space. And what I found there, astonishingly to me at the time, was a very similar conversation, almost identical. We had this conversation of what is the purpose of the corporation? What is the purpose of corporate law? A revisiting of Milton Friedman's shareholder value doctrine, which was developed not just coincidentally at the same time as the Chicago School of Antitrust, but actually, it's the same people. It's the same school of thought. We had, I suppose the kind of difference was that it felt like that conversation around corporate governance had actually gone a little bit further. We'd gone into legal innovations, creations of different types of companies, so B Corps and benefit corporations. And I know there's also Sistema Bay in Latin America. These are companies that seek to serve not just shareholders, but also other stakeholders, their workers, communities, and the environment. There were kind of a growing understanding. We had to move away from this kind of tired concept of corporate social responsibility towards more robust corporate accountability, although I would say that those efforts have not been completely successful. And a kind of broader movement of stakeholder capitalism, really embodied by the statements coming out of Davos. I put 2020 there, but also 2021, Business Roundtable, and so on, the ESG movement, impact investing, and the annual statements by Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, urging his investee companies to take more responsibility. So we had these two parallel conversations. And where they came together for me is understanding that actually the conversation that was happening in the antitrust space was about monopoly power. And the flip side of that is corporate responsibility. So you have corporate power and corporate responsibility, two sides of the same coin. And actually, when you kind of go back and look historically at the regulation of the corporation as an entity, they were dealt with together. And where this led me to was a kind of try and have a kind of systemic understanding of how these laws interact, but also the context in which this lawmaking happens. Because I think that in competition policy, there's a real temptation for us to seek some kind of universal objective truth, but there is also the reality that competition policy actually is enforced and must be interpreted in context. And the context that we face today is alarming levels of inequality globally, whether you think about across countries, but also within countries. And that in my country, in the UK, sorry, everybody else said where they were coming from. I'm calling in from London, and the city of London versus the regions in the UK. That's just an enormous wealth disparity there. We've got huge regional levels of inequality. A reality of pending and imminent, potentially environmental collapse. Pandemic, none of us can ignore that now. The possibility that pandemic will just be the beginning of that stage of environmental collapse, the human society outgrowing or attempting to outgrow the boundaries of our planet. Rising threats to democracy. and connected to all of those, but in ways that I think have been not really underexplored, rising market concentration across the world. So my contention is that within that context, competition policy must adapt. We can no longer do it the same way we've been doing it before. So the question that I really ask in the book and explore by going through the history of corporate law and of antitrust is to ask whether there's a more holistic approach. And I think the answer is, if we want to understand how we can approach antitrust in a more holistic way, the starting point is that being pro-competition is not the same as being anti-monopoly. What I mean by that is that competition is just one solution to our problem of monopoly and to the problem of corporate power. And I would argue that it's actually quite difficult to see other solutions to the monopoly problem within the framing of competition and consumer welfare. In fact, it's actually difficult to see monopoly. Historically in the Chicago school antitrust thinking, harmful monopolies didn't really exist, because a monopoly would be outcompeted, or they would lose their standing through competition from rivals, and it was not possible to have a durable monopoly. I think that we can see that, at least in ways that materially matter to the way that society is arranged and how the economy is arranged, that is false. It also means that we start to think of this kind of ambitious stakeholder capitalism agenda, and we see that it's completely ignored the question of monopoly. This idea is that companies will be good if we ask them to, and there's no kind of question over, is there an implication if these companies are also monopolies? In fact, actually, the kind of prevailing wisdom is that it's actually better to deal with monopolists. They have the resources to say invest in sustainability. They also have the market sway. You just persuade Larry Fink to change how he does asset managing, and suddenly you've moved $7 trillion or however much they have in assets under management. The problem is that if we concede monopoly and we only push for corporate responsibility, if we just leave antitrust and let it keep going as it's going, allowing markets to become more concentrated, and we only try and improve corporate responsibility, then we will find that companies will always act too little too late. We can see that really starkly in the oil and gas sector, but you can see it elsewhere, that companies will act, and they will act once there is an existential threat to their business model, but they won't act before then. And that, on the types of context and problems that we're facing as a human society, I think is inadequate. I'd say there are all sorts of issues around some of the policies that I will describe, ways in which we might adapt competition policy. But I would say the biggest problem is actually that it's becoming extremely unfashionable to be an anti-monopolist. So there is a real squeamishness about using the language of monopoly, using the language of corporate power. And I think that's, if anything, that's the kind of first hurdle that we need to try to leap over. So in my book, I develop an agenda for stakeholder antitrust, and in some of my subsequent works, I've fleshed that out into an alternative to the consumer welfare standard, which is the excessive power standard. I won't go into too much detail here. There are some other papers listed here. If anyone's interested, I can also send some others. But it really goes back to the original purpose of the kind of modern anti-monopoly laws, the Sherman Act in 1890, and the central purpose to constrain undemocratic concentrations of power. Now, I think that whenever somebody proposes changes to competition policy, the first question we should ask them is, what do you think the role of antitrust is? Because once we know what someone thinks that the role is, then we can make sense of and assess the proposals that they make. So I will say transparently that I believe that the role of antitrust is to maintain the balance of power between the private sector, the state, and the demos. And I also believe that it has a role in promoting economic and political democracy. So if you want to argue with the proposals, then we should start by arguing with the role of antitrust, because I think that has quite a few implications. Now, one of the questions is, if I'm talking about excessive power, if I'm talking about raising up the power of stakeholders, am I starting from the Tim Wu position that the curse of bigness, big is bad? I don't really make a judgment on that in my book. What I do say is that what's unarguable is that big is power. So whether it is good or bad is something that we must kind of openly and transparently assess. And we can't make assumptions that big is good, which has been the typical assumption around economies of scale. We also know that we have diseconomies of scale. We also know that we have lobbying power and all other ways that bigness and economic resources can be leveraged into other spheres. So I think at the very least, we have to, the kind of biggest reform in a way that I propose for antitrust policy is to look power straight in the face and identify it, and then we can come up with solutions and also ask the question whether antitrust is the right tool to use. But I don't think we can do any of that until we've identified power. What is excessive power? Well, I don't have a concrete answer for you there. I think it's a huge research agenda within competition law and economics. It's almost a completely green field. There's hardly anything there in terms of research. It does mean that we are moving beyond the paradigm of consumer welfare and this idea that market power is just market power over price or output. We do have some things that we can incorporate into this body of research. So we have a growing body of research around global value chains and the role that lead firms play in those global value chains. We have an understanding from contract law around bargaining power, unequal bargaining power, undue influence, and so on. Through the literature around big tech, we have an understanding of platform power. Platformization is obviously not restricted to the tech sector per se, so this is something that we can start to apply elsewhere. And I would say the least explored is political power. There is obviously in the kind of very rich field of political economy a much richer understanding of political power, but it is not really connected into the antitrust sphere, and that's something that I would like to see change. Now, does that mean that consumer welfare and price impacts are irrelevant? No, it means that they're part of the analysis, but only part. Other things are also relevant. So impacts on inequality, on economic security. I just saw this here, ecosystem stability, on the spread of misinformation, on the speed of transition to a sustainable economy. And it's not that if you can prove that a merger somehow is bad for the spread of misinformation, it doesn't mean you necessarily block the merger. But if it seems that actually merging might actually promote more misinformation or change the protocols in some way that this would be worse, then it does mean that the moment of merging is the time at which to do something about it. And you don't just assume that whichever poor regulator is going to have to deal with it afterwards and now facing a bigger, more powerful merged company. It also means being really clear-eyed about the business realities, the imperative of shareholder value, the rising trend of financialization of non-financial firms, the ability for firms to use financial leverage, regulatory arbitrage, and the possibility that actually all of the efficiencies, or I should say some of a proportion of the efficiencies that are claimed in merger cases and even in dominance cases are actually, earmarked for shareholders. Do they actually go to the wider public? Do they serve the public interest? Do they even go to consumers? So stepping back, it means that by honing in on excessive power, in one sense, we're kind of zooming in on that particular aspect. Another way, we're zooming out and looking at the entire system of monopoly, all of the legal and institutional and infrastructural economic processes and regulations and systems that actually facilitate the creation of monopoly power. The stakeholder antitrust model also has another important implication, which is that process impacts outcomes. We don't assume that we can kind of always again, come up with some neutral, objective understanding just by looking at, say, the merging parties' submissions. It means that stakeholder consultation becomes really important. We should be talking, or competition authorities should be talking to workers, unions, civil society, environmental groups, entrepreneurs, and consumers. Many do not even talk to consumers very much. And this has impacts for implications for case prioritization. It also has implication for the governance of competition authorities. I don't know what the case is in Latin America. I know for the Competition and Markets Authority, much of the governance is dominated by competition experts who have expertise primarily from private practice. So that's one perspective. Many of these other perspectives are unrepresented. That includes, by the way, for the particularly the kind of subset of the inquiry panel, these are the individuals who determine our kind of phase 2 process in the UK. So, you know, how democratic are those panels? Not very in my argument. It also means that there's an interesting role for building capacity amongst stakeholders to engage on competition issues. This is an entirely new role of competition advocacy for competition authorities. In general, competition authorities use their advocacy powers or role to tell stakeholders about the competition laws, tell them that they exist, that they are there enforcing them. And I think a lot of them tend to take this role of promoting a culture of competition. Here I'm talking about enabling civil society and engaging with civil society on question of monopoly, actually reclaiming that lost language of monopoly. Again, I can't speak for Latin America, but I can certainly speak for the UK and the British press. You know, there is almost no discussion of monopoly at all. I mean, you sometimes get a discussion of a particular merger, but it is often assumed that the competition authorities are kind of you know, looking at all these broad different impacts when actually they're not being looked at anywhere, and there's no kind of public scrutiny, because there is a perception that much of this process and language has really strayed so far into kind of a technocratic language, and that is really only understood by very few people, and I think that should change. So what does this mean for competition policy? As I've already mentioned, it means that identifying market power is a central role for antitrust. It also means that there are a range of anti-monopoly tools. I don't use this bucket, these 3Ds kind of buckets in my book, but I wish I had, because it's a much better way to organize the information. But the kind of 3 types of proposals is: one, you use anti-monopoly or competition policy to disperse power. That means robust enforcement that we would be very familiar with, blocking mergers, bringing monopoly cases, designing adequate remedies, including breakups where they're helpful. It also means where dispersal is not possible or it is not beneficial. For example, you have a natural monopoly or some situation where breaking up a concentration of economic power isn't desirable. Then you would seek to democratize that power, giving influence to stakeholders over company decision-making through corporate governance models, but also stimulating countervailing power. So that might be through allowing antitrust exemptions for cooperative formation or other cooperative efforts that allow for a balancing of power in the economy. And finally, if it's not possible to disperse or democratize power, this is the most kind of controversial of the proposals, is that companies are formed, you know, at the pleasure of the public in the public interest. You know, they are a legal construct created as a creature of the state. And my argument is that companies that repeatedly breach the public interest should be wound up. So that's dissolving companies. This is actually a possibility under UK law. We have a provision that's the public interest winding up. It's an insolvency type proceeding, but it's not to do with insolvent companies. It's to do with companies that have breached the public interest. And this is also possible in each of the individual states in the US. I have no idea whether you have something similar in the different kind of Latin American countries. But what it really is to go back to the understanding that corporations as entities have power that is granted through the state, limited liability, different tax implications, and so on. They are creatures of the state, and if we have corporations that really are not serving the public interest, then we should question their right to exist. So the conclusion is that I argue that excessive power analysis has a role to play in rebalancing power within the economy and across society, and that's a role that antitrust is, or at least was once, designed to play. And it's also a role that's not currently being played by any other regulatory tools. No other regulator is actually designed to address corporate power in that sense. this whole kind of vision potentially transforms stakeholders from passive recipients of market capitalism's benefits and its harms into active participants in economic outcomes. So this is a very different vision of competitive markets than the one that's usually within competition policy. It also identifies the corporation as the rightful site for regulation and for democratization, and that competition law is the kind of appropriate regulatory touch point, that the moment at which companies are in front of the competition authorities, that is the moment at which we should solve some of these other problems. It's a much broader conception of competition law and corporate law, much more holistic approach to corporate regulation. I argue that we need to understand the system of monopoly. And I think most of all, it's about opening up this debate so that we actually encourage others to engage in some of these questions and not lose sight of the context. I've probably gone over my time, but I'm going to do a very brief postscript, which was that after publishing my book, I got quite a lot of interest from different groups around what to do about all of this, and I was in touch with the architects of the US anti-monopoly movement, and I was asking them, why is there no similar movement in Europe and beyond? I was not aware of anything. And so I was put in touch with a couple of individuals whose background is spending the last 15 years working on tax justice issues and really transforming the conversation around a niche legal area, tax, and bringing it into the public discourse. So these seem to be the perfect people to me to take on this agenda. So together we have formed an organization, the Balanced Economy Project. It is a global anti-monopoly movement. Our goal is to connect competition experts to civil society, to policymakers, politicians, and journalists. And we aim to kind of work across the political spectrum, because we can speak to the corruption of markets, which more kind of libertarian political actors might understand, but also kind of broader harms of monopoly. So I think that this is quite a powerful agenda. Our role, our kind of mission is really the next 3 bullet points. This is what we're aiming to do, which is to tell a new story, building on the story that's the neo-Brandeisian, Lena Khan type story in the US, adapting it for Europe, for the UK, for the rest of the world, really. We're interested in working with people all over the world and adapting this story, including in lower income countries and in countries elsewhere in the world. We want to take on and expose and understand and interrogate the system of monopoly. I think it's really vital to understand the role of competition policy within that system. Reclaim this language of monopoly. And this first kind of limb we started to do, I put the link there in our newsletter, The Counterbalance. The latest edition is a really powerful interview with Tommaso Valetti, the former chief economist of DG Comp, and he really speaks to this system of monopoly issue, which is, how is it that the in his kind of analysis, why is it that the role of competition lawyers and economists in that system seems to be pushing very much in the direction of concentration rather than competition. Our kind of second role is to build capacity amongst stakeholders and in civil society. I've talked a little bit about that. And that's so that we enable civil society to frame their concerns, which may be around biodiversity, they may be around human rights, but frame them in language that is actually cognizable within competition policy, whilst at the same time influencing competition policy and expanding how we think of competition policy. But a longer term goal is really to build infrastructure, to create a platform through which civil society can on an ongoing basis engage on these issues. And that is also becomes a kind of more open door on the competition authority side. So my kind of final point is, please do get in touch if you'd like to be involved. And we're looking for people genuinely all over the world. It's a hugely ambitious project, but our goal is to really act, as facilitators, amplifiers. We don't want to reinvent any wheels that are already being created elsewhere. So we would very much like to have the benefit of insights that are happening, particularly outside Europe, because it's not something that we're overly familiar with. So I will end there with my thanks. Thanks for listening, and I'm really excited to hear Fernando's responses and comments and all of the questions coming from the Q&A.
Michelle, thank you very much. It is indeed a very thought-provoking presentation and book, and I guess that we will certainly open a debate today after we have the chance of hearing Fernando. So we've already have a couple of questions in Spanish in the chat. Anyone who is interested, please type your questions in English or Spanish. I'll read them out loud later. I actually have a couple of questions for Michelle, both on the book and the Counterbalance project. But first, let's invite Fernando. It's also great to have you, Fernando, and thank you for writing a piece in Spanish about Michelle's book so that we can all know about it. And the stage is yours.
Thank you, Juan David. Thank you, Michelle, for accepting our invitation to this event. It's a real pleasure to be commenting here on your book. Let me start first with a personal note on why this book appeared so appealing to me even before reading it. First, as Michelle comes from a family with origins in Bangladesh, but living her whole adult life in the UK, I suspected that a certain degree of uprooting feeling might be part of her positive character traits. Well, I've been living for more than 15 years in Santiago, but I come from the deep south. I come from Concepcion. I was born there and grew up in Concepcion. Well, okay, Concepcion is not Dhaka or any other city in Bangladesh, and Santiago is certainly not London. But the feeling of uprooting, I thought could be quite similar. Second, Michelle, she has told us, has been involved in both academia and legal practice. And it was during her years in private practice when her awakening took place. This is quite different from ideas coming from people that have spent their whole life either in academia or in politics without direct contact with markets functioning. This rich experience is evident once one reads the book. Third, the book dealt from the approach of power with the two legal disciplines I've been most involved with in the last 15 years. Being myself intellectually close to liberalism as an intellectual tool to fight any misuse and excess of power, I felt that reading this book was a kind of a current task and a professional duty. On the political power that you mentioned, maybe it's good to take to the floor that Luigi Ingales in this book, in his book called Competition for the People, Capitalism for the People, tried to make the link between political power and competition law. And more recently, Francisco Beneke, which is a researcher at the Max Planck Institute, is trying to formalize or to make a proposal on the links between political power and competition policy. It's good to note these two developments on the relation between political power and conventional competition policy. But finally, what convinced me to get in touch with Michelle was the notice I received of Michelle's participation in the Leeds Soir, which is London's favorite women pop soir. Being a musician myself, I needed no further signing off for doing this. Afterwards, when I started reading the book and taking notes, I really felt that this was the best summary and updated presentation of the progressive views of the state of development of these two legal disciplines, originally designed to constrain power. Since the core argument of the book was already presented by Michelle, I won't go forward on presenting it, of course. I invite you to enjoy its reading, particularly for those interested on which might be the future developments in the area. Just let me add that the book has been chosen by Martin Wolf at the Financial Times as Best Economic Book in 2020, shortlisted for the Financial Times, and McKinsey Bracken Power Prize in 2018. And Simon Holmes, member of the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal, put in written that not since I read Kate Raworth Donat's Economics how I felt such a need to rethink our approach to so many issues facing society. Now, let me go to the comments of the content of the book and maybe propose some questions to promote the debate. I divided my comments on the book in three areas, and afterwards I have some comments regarding the project. You have the Balanced Economy Project. First, group of questions. On the North-South divide, Chicago antitrust and shareholder theory are pillars of the sole or primary growth-focused policy, which is usually known as trickle-down economics. In his speech to Congress a few days ago, President Biden attacked trickle-down economics as an idea that has never worked. In rich countries, some progressive academics are proposing an active degrowth agenda, or what seems appealing for a larger number of constituents, growth or development within planetary boundaries agenda. In your view, Michelle, what this progressive agenda means for mid and low income countries where their domestic growth has allowed them to reach not even the level of satisfaction of its population basic needs, or at the best, they are locked in the middle income crowd. Another feature of several Latin American countries and South countries in other regions is the presence of endemic problems, some of them beyond the rule of law, such as the power of military, the power of drug mafias, and extended corruption. And some others are related to path dependence problems in its productive metrics. I mean, too dependent on a few commodities, and hence an extractive productive matrix. Do you think your research agenda and proposals should be corrected when these particularities are brought to the equation? If yes, how? The second group of questions, and inspired on Ken Bimmore's Natural Justice book, is the distinction between the good, the right, and the feasible. When paradigms are in the transit to change, it seems timely to ask who are the losers in that change? For who it is bad rather than good? For who it is wrong rather than right? And in order to anticipate future scenarios, differentiating between feasible and unfeasible changes may be useful. Do you think you could comment on your research agenda and proposal under this framework? Let me give you some additional insights. For instance, antitrust progressivism in the US seems divided between progressives within mainstream, who claim under-enforcement but remain loyal to the consumer welfare standard, and progressive beyond mainstream, which are called usually hipster antitrust or neo-brandations, who claim that consumer welfare standard should be abandoned and replaced by neo-structuralism. Which of these troops will win on feasibility? On the corporate debate, on the other hand, centered mainly on the firm's purpose, the progressive spectrum is more varied. Which of them will win on feasibility? Another insight for this good, right, feasible. Since the major problems of humanity now faces today are dependent on dealing with the power of big corporations in concentrated markets, each of them with their own incentives and particularities, shouldn't be a natural step forward in your research agenda to follow an industry by industry approach rather than a broad competition cooperation approach? And a final group of miscellaneous questions. In that group, I will ask you to comment on globalization and regulatory competition. I mean by that, the fear of investors going away when the playing level field is not the same in all the countries. A discussion very developed in the tax area. Another topic is the effective democratization of the firm. Some immediate measures to the democratization of the firm are the inclusion of workers within the governance of the big firm. However, you show in your book that this is not a very good solution for the whole problem, since workers are also an interest group. There is a third issue, or third topic I would like you to comment on is this idea of plurality of goals, any instrument, versus the more conventional rule of one goal, one instrument. And finally, in these miscellaneous issues is regarding private enforcement. Do you think empowering mechanisms of power enforcement wouldn't help society being more involved in this research agenda? Well, and finally, let me propose just 4 topics regarding your Balanced Economy Project. You mentioned already which is the working agenda. So, but you didn't mention how initiatives as such can get appropriate financing. In the wording of the discourse, when one wants to change the conventional paradigm, how to avoid the we versus they divide, which leads usually to populism, and retake the we all, the ourselves approach when advocating for solutions. Again, on the activism side, shouldn't an industry by industry approach be more effective than a broad approach of changing society's core regulations? And finally, on progressive academia, progressive activism, and women. Why are females taking the lead here? I don't want to mention anyone for the risk of excluding some important, but the name everybody knows the name of the women that are leading the progressive agenda in different areas. Why are women leading instead of men? So these are my comments. Many thanks.
Well, great work, Fernando. Thank you very much for your comments. And Michelle, you have a lot in your plate, so let's go with your reactions, and then we'll go with the chat questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much for your really thoughtful questions and thoughtful reading and thoughtful review of the book. And I'm really pleased that you were motivated to read it and to engage and then to open it up to a kind of different audience. I would never have been able to write something in Spanish, so I wouldn't have been able to reach out to that audience. So I'm really pleased that you were able to do that for me. Okay, so that's a lot of questions that you've asked. You did warn me of these questions beforehand, so I have had some time to think about them. We start with this question of growth in Latin America, or growth in, say, other parts of the world, some lower income countries, countries where growth has not yet yielded the benefits that we might want. I suppose I don't have a kind of fully reasoned answer to that, but two things come to mind. One is increasingly, my work is really drawing on the lessons from systems theory and systems thinking. And one of the main kind of I suppose, lessons that I've taken is that it is often the case that the kind of stated purpose of the system is completely opposite to the real purpose of the system, and that you may push in the direction, for example, of growth and end up with almost the opposite of growth. So what do I mean by that? I mean that sometimes it is precisely the problems of growth that we are trying to solve with more growth. And growth may not actually be the right solution. I would say that, you know, history tells us that the phenomenal growth which becomes the model for everywhere else in the world, in say the industrialized European countries, in the US and so on, was really predicated. I mean, I think I maybe know this or I'm interested in this, particularly given my my family background, but you know, it's predicated on colonialization, on extraction, on theft, and on exploitation. And so the reality is that no country can replicate that growth without also replicating those models of effectively getting resources and labor and you know, other things for free. And since that's no longer possible, because there are a few places in the world that are kind of left to exert that kind of power against, I do think that the idea that we might have the kind of similar model is flawed. And the reason why I think that's relevant to competition policy is because so much of the competition policy that I very briefly was at the World Bank doing competition policy, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. And there the idea was that you kind of export, and this was, you know, over a decade ago. I'm sure that some things have changed, maybe not that many, but you know, export this idea of one model for industrial organization, one model for how an economy should operate both internally and externally with global markets. And that's the kind of model that works in Europe, but it works for kind of very particular historical reasons. And so, I mean, that's not a satisfactory answer. I'm definitely not an expert on Latin America. So I'm sure you will have better, more interesting thoughts around that. But I suppose the overall message, I think, is that growth may not be a solution. The second question around should I adapt this model if we are to take into account the particular political situations in particular countries, whether it's corruption in certain countries in the world, whether we're thinking about the power of other institutions, or you know, you mentioned military or mafia and so on. I think the core message of what I'm arguing is that we have to look at that entire kind of structure of power and be really kind of honest with ourselves about it. So there is no point in having a kind of a very well developed competition regime that is taking place within a country where actually, you know, it's like a sideshow. There's a kind of going through the motions. I would say that in Europe, we have an extremely busy regulatory industry. I mean, it's not just the competition authorities, it's the lawyers, the economists, and all of the advisors and so on. And the question is, you know, is it truly apolitical? Is there really, you know, no influence? I think we can answer that question in a European context. There are some issues, there are some things that are better than, say, they are in the US, which is the other country I know well. But I think all of this is relevant to the understanding of power. So where are those flows of power in an individual domestic economy? And that will determine how you can have a meaningful competition policy. Right, so your next set of questions on feasibility, and you've asked about what is actually feasible. So is it feasible that antitrust will be able to evolve into this, say, more progressive version? I think within antitrust, it's almost kind of uniquely feasible because actually in many countries, it doesn't really involve even changing the law, which is a really big challenge for other legal areas. It's largely about changing like the intellectual mindset of how many of these issues are approached. Of course, there will be resistance from within the corporate world. And who are the losers? Well, I suppose the losers are, I mean, I don't think the losers are even the companies, because I think actually when you look at it from a system of monopoly perspective, say if you take mergers, it's often the case that the companies don't the vast majority of mergers are not successful in terms of integrating two companies. They don't necessarily even generate shareholder value. So we end up with a situation where I would say the advisors do very well out of the situation. So lawyers, investment bankers, economists, and so on. But I think that it's the case for many of the companies anyway that I've kind of been aware of, that it's not so much the question of I want to merge with a particular company. Sometimes that's the case, but it's more like we have a merger strategy, which is we want to merge where it is legally possible. So I think the thing that companies want more than anything is certainty. So that will determine whether we have a feasibility issue. Is it that we create a version of antitrust that is so uncertain that companies will not be able to plan for the future? I think that is where we have a real issue around introducing these other factors into competition policy, as I'm arguing we should. There is this issue of feasibility in that sense. And I suppose this links to your second question about keeping consumer welfare but adapting it or going into a more structural approach. The question that's asked is around administrability. Can we administer a version? Structural approach is actually extremely administrable in the sense that it tends to take a really bright line approach. If you have a market that has 5 players or fewer, this merger is not allowed, as an example. And so if you take that approach, in that sense, it is extremely feasible. And I can't see why, kind of from a legal political perspective, it wouldn't be possible. But again, it's about political will. Where is one of the kind of, I suppose, big messages of the system of monopoly perspective is it's not enough to just change the way we do competition policy. You have to look at all of the other levers that are being pulled within the economy that push companies to consolidate. This really valid question of should we be going industry by industry in my analysis, and also for the Balanced Economy Project. It might just be my own kind of preference. I'm a real big picture person, so I'm really interested in that, zooming kind of right out. There will be those who are really interested in getting in particular sectors. That's one of the reasons why for the Balanced Economy Project we want to partner with other people, because there will be somebody who is a real expert in pharmaceuticals or in tech or in agriculture or whatever it is. That person currently is not me, so it's not my goal to do that. But also I think it's really important to show the commonalities between different sectors. Like, for example, I think there's this idea that tech is somehow exceptional, but I think that we can see many of the same techniques, issues, certainly the same kind of history in other sectors. So I will continue to proceed at my big picture level, but I highly encourage others to go industry by industry. So on the question of globalization, and so I think of this in terms of national competitiveness. We have in the UK, we've just had an independent review done by a Conservative Party politician, John Penrose. He's done a review of UK competition policy. And I encourage you to read the report. It makes really interesting reading. Almost 80% of what he's talking about, I don't think many people on this call would recognize as competition policy in a way. He's actually really talking about competitiveness, and he's talking about how can we ensure that our competition policy does not deter international capital effectively. This is obviously especially relevant for the UK after Brexit. And so borrowing very heavily from the analysis that has taken place in the tax world and from my tax justice colleagues, they have a really useful way of looking at this, which is that there are kind of 2 ways that you can upgrade your economy, or you can improve your economy. You can either upgrade your laws and to increase productivity, you can upgrade your standards. The competitiveness agenda encourages you to downgrade your laws in order to allow for inflows of capital. And then the question that I have, and my kind of extreme skepticism, is how beneficial those flows of capital genuinely are to the general public. You raised the question of democratization of the firm, and there's a really mixed record of having workers on boards. But I feel like my position is that it's not a bad idea, but that we have to really understand that you will always have an insider-outsider issue whenever you, which is one of the reasons why I don't think it's enough to say we democratize the firm and we leave it, we leave monopoly kind of untouched, because you're effectively allowing for the sharing of rents between workers and shareholders, but at the expense of the rest of society, which is why we talk a lot about the infrastructure, the rest of the infrastructure, like within society, within the rest of the economy. There needs to be kind of ways and platforms and access, the competition authorities, other authorities need to have sufficient access. We need to think of democratization kind of in its widest sense. When you ask the question about plurality of goals, should we have one goal for one instrument, or I'm talking about many, many goals? I think the interesting thing about competition policy, so when I studied competition law, which was in the UK and in the US 10, 15 years ago, I believed at the time that I was learning fact. I was kind of learning maybe like a legal science, but it was fact. Either something was competitive or something was enhancing competition, or it was anti-competitive, and there were kind of techniques that we would use to identify one from the other. I've now come to understand through this kind of larger context that actually competition policy is inherently political, and it is. In actuality, it is industrial policy, particularly if, like in the UK, you have no other industrial policy. Then competition policy really fills that gap, because you're effectively saying our industrial policy is that companies have a blanket permission to merge, for example. Or we will not challenge dominant companies. And so I think once we understand competition policy as industrial policy, at least for now and in certain jurisdictions, then we have to see that all of those other factors that I'm saying should be taken into account, those are impacted and implicated anyway, whether we choose to account for them or not. There will be impacts on workers, there will be impacts on the environment, there will be impacts on communities, society, etc. And the question is, do we want to look at them? And the reason I think we should look at them is really coming back to that issue of distortion of the entire regulatory system, political power, and so on. I think if we allow markets to continue to concentrate, allow companies in those markets to dictate their own regulatory environment, then all of these other issues never get picked up anywhere else. So we do have to look at them within competition policy. I think that's driven, again, by the context. I didn't quite get the question, sorry, on private enforcement, so you might have to ask that again. I mean, I'm in favor of private enforcement as a way to involve other stakeholders. And then I see we're kind of running out of time for the Q&A, so I'll just very quickly talk about the questions in relation to the Balanced Economy Project. The question of funding, really important question. We have seed funding for the project, we are fundraising, we are operating now primarily on a model of working with other established think tanks and organizations to kind of co-fund different projects. But one of the biggest issues in this area is because monopoly has been so off the agenda for so long. Most foundations that are interested in big economic questions have not been interested in monopoly. The really vibrant anti-monopoly movement in the US has a fair amount of funding, but there is I would say, narrowness in geographic scope. Mostly they tend to be focused on the US and not really interested in what's going on in anywhere else in the world. So getting interest elsewhere is something that is part of our kind of challenge as we go forward. I'm really interested in your thoughts on how do you reclaim the kind of we all language and not have the kind of we versus they. I think that potentially influenced by the kind of partial genealogy of the project in terms of its link to tax justice, we are taking the kind of tax justice approach, which I suppose does identify a they in terms of the kind of particular actors that we're interested in or kind of that we're targeting against. But again, I think the way that we avoid that language is by talking at the system of monopoly level, because really we are talking about an entire system rather than individual players. But it is, I think, fair to say that the system benefits some more than others, and those some are the ones that will lose, and it's quite hard to say that they're part of us and we all, because I think in some cases they really do operate in a completely different way. And why is it women that are leading this debate? I will say that actually in the US it's kind of 50-50 on women and men. What I've noticed, that I have no answer for why this is the case, is that there are a lot of women and minorities, or kind of people who are second generation immigrants, or people who are first generation immigrants. I'm sure there are some of those too, and people who, you know, my two colleagues for the Balanced Economy Project, I don't think they would mind me categorizing them as white men, but they are in their own ways outsiders. And so I think there is something about being an outsider and seeing some of the issues with the system, but also having the ability and license to say something. I think we have so many incredibly bright people who are working in competition, but often, say if they're in private practice, they may think something privately, but they won't be able to say it publicly. A lot of our knowledge is kind of in a way hidden behind these paywalls, if you like, where you can't kind of get access to it unless you can pay for it. So I think that I'm in a really privileged position of my own creation, I suppose, by being a little bit outside. It gives me a freedom to deal with these issues. And I think maybe that's true for others, but we don't have like a club or anything, so I've not asked anybody else what they think or why they're doing it. But okay, I think I covered most of Fernando's fabulous questions, so thank you for that.
Indeed, Michelle, thank you very much. And we do have a few questions for you, most of them in Spanish, so I'll try to translate. Before that, I'll take the advantage of being the first one to speak, and I have a couple of questions for you. So my first question is about another book that was published also in the same, I guess, year, and at least almost month of yours, and it's a Competition Overdose by Professors Esrahi and Stuckey, and I can imagine that it speaks to you somehow. And I was wondering, in that case, how do you connect your book with the idea of how competition sometimes is excessive in itself? I know that this is one of your arguments, but I would like to see how you connect with that. The other one has to do with the idea of connecting the project with places beyond Europe and the US. And that reminded me of a session that we had recently with in another space of Latin American antitrust, which is the Instituto de Defensa de Competencia, where we had the chair of Mexico's competition agency, and she was asked about how Mexico and other Latin American countries could deal with big tech. And she said, well, we are trying to do research, and there's actually an ongoing investigation about online advertising. But she also acknowledged how, well, these firms are based abroad and everything is abroad, and there may be no role for us in reality. We are somehow excluded from this conversation. And I've heard similar ideas from other people, former directors of agencies, of antitrust agencies in Latin America. So I was wondering, how do you see that? And now let me read the 5 questions, and I think you'll have a lot in your plate, but let's try to do this in just one round, and you pick how much you want to focus on the questions, and you're of course free to decide which questions you want to answer. So this question was actually posed early on. So just at the beginning of your talk, Manuel from Panama asked, well, is the problem competition or competition laws, or the institutions that are in charge of enforcing competition laws, which of them are failing? So this was very early on. By the end of your talk, there were other questions. So again, Manuel asked, well, if the central role of antitrust is identifying market power instead of identifying the abuse of market power, wouldn't that be using a per se rule rather than a rule of reason approach? So quite US antitrust based question. Then Guillermo asked, do you think that development of competition standards at the global level within the WTO framework could help to achieve your aim of more ethical, sound competition law? Another question from Manuel, do you believe that a merger among two companies that does not negatively affect competition, but that may somehow negatively affect the environmental, social, and governance indexes may be objected or conditioned, I guess, by an antitrust authority, merger authority? And the last question from Tania Zúñiga, who is a part of ASCOLA as well, and she's based in Peru. She's asking, monopolies should be prohibited in the constitutional text, or should the Constitution rather, no, wait, I have to read this twice. Okay, or should the Constitution just take into account the anti-competitive effects of the abuse of market power? So whether the constitutions of countries should prohibit monopolies, or should the abuse of market power be be prohibited in the constitutions? So that's it, Michelle. You have a lot in your plate, but we have 15 minutes for you to finalize.
Fabulous, thank you. Okay, well, I'll take them one by one because I haven't had a chance to think of a better organization. So on the first question, Competition Overdose, I really enjoyed that book. I think they developed much more richly that particular angle, which is the extent to which competition as a dynamic can often be harmful. I kind of broaden it and also kind of talk about power, and I suppose mine is more of a campaigning book, but given that I was nervous putting out my thesis, competition is killing us, I was very reassured to see two really established highly respected competition professors putting out a book before mine that kind of already said that controversial piece. So I was really pleased to see that, and it's a great book, so I recommend people go have a look at it. It's really interesting, this question of going beyond Europe and what is the role for competition authorities. Are they actually excluded in some way from, say, in particular the debate around big tech? I mean, I think the same conversation is happening in Europe, and no doubt that is one of the reasons why we've ended up in Europe at the European level with the DMA and a kind of regulatory model again in the UK, because is it politically realistic to talk about, say, breakups? Like, how would that actually happen when we're talking about US headquartered companies, both in a kind of almost a practical level, but also at a kind of geopolitical level? I would say, though, that firstly, there are other options. You can go the kind of more regulatory route. And I'd say the most interesting of the regulatory possibilities are, for me anyway, are those that are around interoperability. And the reason I say that is because much of the regulatory approach, the biggest flaw of the regulatory approach is that it takes as given the existing power of the various gatekeeper companies under the European language, or strategic market status companies under the UK language. It kind of accepts them and kind of as they are, and then places all sorts of obligations on them. Whereas the obligation of interoperability begins to chip away at that and starts to open up the market, if done correctly, open up markets to other players, which starts to then lead to a situation where you don't have those players as dominant. And so, I can imagine that maybe as a bloc, Latin American countries or individual countries might be able to insist on interoperability as a requirement for presence within the region, for example. And that's in a way much more feasible. That's what the idea from the European level was, well, this is how we can get all of our kind of national tech startups a foot in the door, is if they have access to the enormous pool of data that Facebook has or Google has or whatever. So I don't see any reason why that wouldn't be possible, but I haven't been part of the kind of Latin American debates on that, so I'm sure there's a much more sophisticated understanding. So the first of the kind of chat questions, is it competition law, or competition authorities? Which one is failing? So I would say that competition, for per the competition overdose idea, competition can sometimes be harmful, but also I would say that we have a very vague and inexact understanding of this concept of competition within competition law, and I would say it's also been abused, gravely abused, within the kind of competition policy and competition discourse. So I would say that competition is not always good. It is sometimes problematic. Competition law has taken this problematic concept and applied it in sometimes perverse ways, and that has been done with the permission, the participation of competition authorities. Although I would say that the wider competition community has been largely responsible for that, including kind of an intellectual and academic community. I think what we're seeing in the last 5 years is a real unraveling of those questions and of those concepts. And so the question, I suppose, touching on one of the points that Fernando made is, is that going to stop at we just amend consumer welfare a little bit, or are we going to completely unravel that concept and say that actually, I argue it's perverse to continue looking to judge competitiveness and only look at whether we have more competition. If we completely ignore the issue of power, then what we see is we get loads of efficiency on paper and highly concentrated markets in reality. So the idea, this concept of competition has led us astray. Am I arguing for this per se approach to dominance? So yeah, what the US would call a no-fault monopoly. So you just by virtue of having a dominant position, you are subject to some kind of responsibility or restriction. I think the quick answer, given the time, is yes, but it would be a completely different understanding of dominance than, say, we have in Europe. So we're thinking about, if you think if you want to understand how deeply how deeply the concept of efficiency goes, and we don't even get to determine a market, to determine market shares until we're talking about increases in price and what's the impact on the market. So I think that even our market definition is kind of based on this kind of historical way of looking at things. I think if we start to look at excessive power, the concept of market definition isn't actually that helpful. So then, which companies are identified as dominant is entirely dependent on which factors you look at in terms of power. So you might take the approach, I think it's in some aspect of telecoms regulation in Europe, there's a model that's based around significant market power that looks at all sorts of different types of indicators of power, and you might identify companies that have that. And really, this is nothing more than what they are now attempting to do with strategic market status or gatekeepers, or in Germany, the undertakings of paramount significance for competition across markets. So there's an understanding that you need to identify the most powerful actors in the economy and act accordingly. So I don't think it quite fits with the per se model, but it's kind of in that direction. Do I think that WTO standards would be helpful, like a harmonization to set better standards of competition? I know that there have been, in the past, lots of arguments for, say, global competition authority, WTO standards, does it go to the UN? Is that the solution, particularly for lower income countries to actually be able to engage with the impacts of a merger that's a kind of global mega merger shouldn't these things all be dealt with centrally? I don't have an answer to that, but I will repeat what somebody who knows quite a lot about these things told me, which is a competition lawyer who had been in private practice for 30 years and then left to go do kind of pursue competition policy outside of that private practice role. And amongst a group of civil society who were saying it would be much easier for us to engage on these issues if we could go to one entity, if we could go to the WTO. And he said that is the absolute worst thing that you could do if you want to resist global concentration, because it is also the most powerful companies that will be able to, you kind of make their life easier. They only have to also go to one entity. So I think there are really big political issues in terms of, well, strategic issues. I think you want WTO standards, depends on what you're after in terms of changing competition policy. Do I think that a negative impact of a merger should be used as a reason to condition or reject a merger? Yes, I do, on the kind of caveat that by looking at other aspects other than just price, we are kind of completely redefining what it means to be anti-competitive and to look at completely other factors. So it is not just because they are kind of ESG factors. I think there's a lot of different understandings of what that means. But once we understand, what is the purpose of competition law, kind of again coming back to that, is it about preventing the creation of excess power, the abuse of excess power? Those are kind of questions still to be answered. That would determine, whether you condition a merger. But I would say that it seems, again, it's the regulatory touch point. That is the moment at which to condition a merger, maybe block a merger, if you can see that there is no other way to disperse or democratize that power, and to kind of remedy those harms. So yes, I would say that shouldn't be off the table. And then I think that last question was similar to the no-fault monopoly question. Is it that the constitution of a country should say that monopolies are prohibited, or is it just the abuse? So in the kind of no-fault monopoly world, it's just the possession of that monopoly power would be sufficient. But I do think that it's kind of, if we do have an entirely new regime that is much more interventionist than our current regime, then we might rethink some of our old models of what is abuse versus what is possession of the power, and what's the likelihood of abuse. And so I've seen there's another question in English, which is very helpful. Thank you.
If you have time, maybe you can tackle it as well. Just while you read it, I'll just say that it's interesting because at the beginning of the 20th century, certain countries of Latin America, including Mexico and others from Central America, actually their constitutions explicitly prohibited monopolies. Later on, they somehow watered down that and came down to the more, let's say, contemporary idea of prohibiting abuse of market power, as in the case of Colombia, which the constitution explicitly mentions controlling the abuse of market power rather than monopolies. But then you have Hernan's question, and with that we'll finish, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, so I would love to know more about actually those kind of historical changes. I only recently learned that the US Bill of Rights was based on an anti-monopoly agenda that kind of came from the UK, and that there was an idea that holding monopoly would be put into the US Constitution, which it isn't. So I'm kind of fascinated by the history in Latin America. I'd love to know more. So this question of what do I think of the trend of market concentration due to the pandemic, and for instance, the application of exemptions such as the failing firm defense. So my understanding is that this has been like a mega year for M&A, and I suppose we're still waiting to see really what the impact is on concentration. I would expect we would see, a lot of failing firms, a lot of consolidation, investors, private equity and others buying up struggling firms and so on. So I'd imagine that we would see substantial market concentration. And then on exemptions, so to the failing firm defense, I mean, I think, so the example, I think we've only had one failing firm case in the UK, and that was a food delivery company that there was a minority investment by Amazon, and they claimed failing firm, and then a few weeks later they had to kind of withdraw that because they weren't failing at all, and actually they were doing really well from the pandemic. In the end, the acquisition was approved. I mean, I think that it's, again, if you look at it from a competition perspective, then the question is how many players are in the market. That's why the failing firm defense exists, right? We want to retain the number of players within the market, so we allow for the failing firm defense. If we look at it from a question of power, then say in the Amazon case that I'm talking about in the UK, the question is the acquisition of a minority share by Amazon an increase of Amazon's power? Ignore the potential competitive impacts in from a number of players' perspective within the market. You know, they claimed that Amazon was the only possible investor, that they were the only one who was interested. So they had all those kind of classic failing firm arguments, and that, you know, the decision, if you read it, Amazon investment in Deliveroo, it looks at all of those kind of traditional competition issues. And my criticism of it is that it kind of completely ignores the way in which this doesn't, you know, it looks at it from the perspective of the target, not looking at it from the perspective of the acquirer. What does this do to Amazon's possibilities of leveraging its power into the food delivery market? And so I think that's where it's a really great question to end on, because I think it's where exactly highlights, you know, where this excessive power paradigm would push possibly in a different direction to the kind of pure competition paradigm.
You finished that. I was not prepared. Michelle, thank you very much. Fernando, again, I'll ask you to unmute so you can also say goodbye. This was a very thought-provoking session. Certainly, we have a lot of things that we should ponder about. Anyone who's interested in antitrust or competition law will find these ideas something that we normally don't hear about, perhaps in Latin America, but it's interesting to introduce new ideas. And of course, Michelle, your book is a great contribution in this sense. Fernando, again, thank you very much for your great comments and for your review of the book in Spanish. And I hope that we can have you both in future events at the Latin American chapter of ASCOLA.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, Fernando.
Bye-bye. Bye, Michelle.
See you soon, hopefully. Bye-bye, everyone. Gracias a todos. Nos vemos en la próxima.
Nos vemos.
Bye, everyone.